Hi, everybody. Welcome to Talking Radio podcast. Today, we're going to be speaking about the Airside Vehicle Operators Permit. This particular license is required by operators at an airfield when needing to communicate with ATC, that's air traffic control, while working on the maneuvering area. So the maneuvering area is that area where there's going to be activity that is needed to be managed by ATC. These personnel are operators that are required to, for example, tow an aircraft from one parking bay to the next, or they could be needed to do a runway inspection. It is critical for them to have communication with ATC in this instance, as air traffic control are managing these particular areas of the airfield. Now, in order for this person to communicate on the radio, they need to have a good understanding of radio communication, radio terminology, and radio procedures. When a person obtains this particular license, it means that they can now communicate with air traffic control at that airfield that they are performing these particular duties. This license is therefore restricted to that airfield that the person has been signed out at. If they're going to go to another airfield, for example, if they've been transferred to another airport and they're going to be carrying out the same duties at the new airport, then they will need to be assessed by the relevant authorities or that operator before they carry out the duties at that airport. This is because all airfields have a different layout in terms of runways, taxiways, parking bays, etc. And the person who's going to be carrying out these duties needs to be familiar with the procedures for that airfield before communicating with air traffic control and carrying out their particular tasks for that duty. Now, in terms of those operators who are going to be driving in vehicles on the airside, they're going to need to have their driver's license for that particular category of vehicle that they're driving, in addition to the radio license, which needs to be valid for that particular airfield or airport. I'm making use of terminologies in this particular podcast which can be understood by everyone. So if you're listening and you're qualified in the aviation field in any particular category, you might not always agree with the terms airport or airfield that I'm using, but I'm using these terms to keep it as simple as possible for everyone that's listening out today. And if that's you out there, thank you very much for listening to the Talking Radio podcast series. The Airside Vehicle Operators Permit has specific procedures that the operator will need to follow, and these are outlined by the regulator for the state that you are operating in. The normal procedure for this particular radio licensing would require the applicant to attend an AVOP radio course. The course would comprise of both theory and practical components. Once the applicant has passed the theoretical and practical component, they would then be issued with their AVOP license. In terms of the practical side of the course, they need to also do some practical simulation, and dependent on the operator that's performing these tasks, they would either do this in a simulator or they would fall under the scope of an on-the-job training instructor who would take them out on the airfield and show them the procedures and monitor their communication with ATC while they are performing their tasks and assess them in that instance over a period of time before doing the final checkout phase. ATC are not notified of the assessments being carried out. However, ATC might be part of the testing team for that particular operator or that particular group of people that are going to be tested. So when the applicant is going out for the practical test, a tip to consider is that you are now part of the operation for that particular period that you are doing the test, and that you are not the only one on the frequency being tested at the time, that you are in live communication with ATC and you can hear everyone else on frequency communicating with them at the same time. None of the operators on frequencies, such as the pilots that you hear communicating, are aware that you are actually undergoing the test during that period. So in a way, this makes you a bit more relaxed, knowing that you're now part of a operation that requires positive communication in order to ensure a successful outcome. Of course, you have the instructor sitting right next to you conducting the practical test, so that would add to part of the nervous element. But in any test that you're going to undertake, whether it be for radio or for any other discipline, there's always going to be an element of nervousness, and you just need to focus that day on what you've been taught. Now, in terms of the communication, it's very similar to that of a pilot when it comes to establishing contact with ATC. And Talking Radio supplies training for this particular discipline, either in a classroom, live, or online as a virtual training course. So AVOP includes personnel such as the fireman, who's going to do a runway inspection, the driver who's going to be towing an aircraft in what they call a tug, the operator is going to be pushing back the aircraft from their parking bay once they're ready to start the engines and taxi. Same operator would also tow the aircraft from one parking bay to the next, or they might tow the aircraft from the hangar area, the technical hangar area, or in simple English, the workshop, to the parking bay, ready for operations by the next flight schedule. In addition to that, there could also be the aircraft engineer who's going to taxi the aircraft from one parking bay to the next. So slightly different in this instance, as the engineer is working on the aircraft and taxiing the aircraft from one position to the next. And in this case, they are not the pilot, so they don't have a pilot's radio license, but they still need to communicate with air traffic control, even if they're just going to be doing what's called a ground run-up in the parking bay. So in other words, they start the aircraft, they take power, but they have the brakes on, obviously. In order to carry this particular task out, they need to communicate with air traffic control and get their permission, start the engines, so that that aircraft in the particular parking bay is doing run-ups, and they need to caution any other aircraft that's taxiing behind that aircraft that there's possible jet blast during this process. So the engineer would request the startup of the engines, and they would also advise ATC once the task is completed. Any person that's going to be attending an AVOP course will need to understand the difference between a runway and a taxiway, not just the layout, but also the procedure that takes place in communication with that particular ATC. At an airfield that manages commercial traffic, you're going to have more than one air traffic controller in the control tower managing a specific part of that airfield itself. So, for example, that person that's managing the aircraft on the apron and on the taxiway is called a ground controller. And that ATC that's managing the traffic on the runway is called the tower controller. And these air traffic controllers are communicating with each other in terms of the traffic movement for their particular area that they have been designated to manage all traffic. Those personnel who do not need to speak to air traffic control, for example, would be the refueler and the catering truck. They're operating on the movement area of the apron. So that is that area which is semi-isolated and does not require continual communication with ATC. Those operators, however, do need to keep a good lookout for all movement on that area by other vehicles and by aircraft that are on the taxi or on the tow. And you will notice that person doing that the next time you at an international airport and you are in transit with a passenger bus from the terminal building to the aircraft that you're going to be departing with, or vice versa. Try and have a look and see what the driver of the vehicle that you're busy standing or sitting in is doing during that process. You also notice that they're complying with what you could call road signs. There's speed control. There's markings on the ground that they're following, and they are being very cautious in their actions. This is not to say that the person who has an AVOP license doesn't need to be cautious. It's just more advantageous for the person who has the AVOP license in this instance, because they have an open line to ATC and are able to hear what's going on around them at the time. Whereas a person who has not been licensed to communicate with ATC is not able to hear what's going on frequency, and therefore needs to keep a sharp lookout in their movements or actions while transiting with the passengers in this instance. The AVOP course focuses on training the personnel to be familiar with not only the difference between the taxiway and the runway in terms of procedures, but also the communication that's going to be taking place on the frequency for that designated area, and how to manage yourself on frequency in communication with ATC while carrying out your specific tasks and duties. The Airside Vehicle Operators Permit is compulsory for those personnel that are going to be operating in those areas designated where communication with ATC will be required. And this permit will be inspected by the regulator to ensure that those personnel that are operating on the maneuvering area for that airport are licensed to do so. If you wish to find out anything further about the Airside Vehicle Operators Permit, please feel free to email me, dylan@talkingradio.net. And we look forward to seeing you in the next podcast. Take care. Goodbye.